Hello there. Welcome to the Saraway channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and even better now that I know you're tuning in to part 2 of this very exciting story, which is very intriguing and you're going to love it. So what we do know is that there is this old inn called the Whispering Willows Inn that really in its heyday was a thriving inn, and there were a lot of very elite people that would stay at this inn because they had a lot of money, because they had made a lot of money in the gold rush. So we're going to find out more about this inn, because it looks like this young family, well, the grandmother is taking her grandchildren to stay at this inn. So let's continue with part 2 of our story tonight. Sadly, my grandfather, whom we called Falcon when he was alive, had died 2 years earlier and was greatly missed by our entire family, most especially my grandmother, Gretchen Bradley. Since Falcon's passing, she had become quite melancholic, which was understandable, of course. I think it got quite lonely for her without Falcon being around, and for a long time she reflected very soulfully on the newspaper article she'd read in the magazine, which she kept safely tucked in that diary of hers, all about the Whispering Willows Inn, and of course about the renovations that had stirred up all kinds of paranormal activity there. I think my grandmother, after losing my grandfather so suddenly due to a massive stroke, really wanted to believe that there was so much more to this life, and that once she died that she would be reunited with my grandfather again on the other side. I remember she told me once that if a ghost materialized in front of her very eyes, that this would be confirmation for her that life did go on even after our deaths. My grandmother desperately wanted to believe that my grandfather Falcon was still very much around. She had claimed a couple of strange, rather bizarre things had happened to her after his death that made her emphatically believe that he was still watching her and was still very much around. One of the stories concerning my late grandfather revolved around a beautiful black and white cat he owned called Purdy. It was on a trip to church on a Sunday morning, when both my grandmother and grandfather had been making their way to the arched doors of the church, as all the parishioners were arriving for the Sunday service that morning. All of a sudden a mother cat darted up to my grandfather, running through the church shrubbery, carrying something in her mouth. She dropped a half-dead kitten at my grandfather's feet, as if to say, "Please help my baby." Then she'd hurriedly scuttled away to hide behind a bush, to see what my grandfather would do next, almost as if she was clandestinely hoping that my grandfather would rescue her little kitten, and he did just that. He picked up the kitten and took it straight to the emergency vet, where he'd been told that the kitten would be unlikely to make it, and would probably die within hours, as it was so astonishingly weak. The kitten had been given intravenous fluids and antibiotics, and went on to make a full recovery that had astounded the vet to such an extent that he had said to my grandfather, "This is a cat that definitely wants to live. He certainly has 9 lives." Purdy became a much-loved member of my grandparents' home, even though in the beginning my grandmother was not all that fond of cats, as she had always preferred dogs. So she was surprised that Falcon had said he wanted to keep the cat, and to call it Purdy. My grandmother would say, "If you want that cat, you better look after her yourself, as I don't intend to watch over her needs." In the end, my grandmother grew to love Purdy very much, in fact almost as much as my grandfather did, which really was saying something, because she didn't consider herself to be a cat person. But Purdy changed all that. Every morning my grandfather would put Purdy's collar on her, so that when she ventured out into the yard, the bell on her collar would ring, so that Purdy, who loved chasing birds and was a masterful huntress, would not have any success in her ambitious endeavours, and there would be no dead carcasses delivered to my grandfather later in the day. My grandfather would fastidiously remove Purdy's collar in the evening from her neck, but after he died, my grandmother failed to continue this practice. But on several occasions she noticed that Purdy was actually wearing her collar. She knew she hadn't put the collar on the cat, So who had done this? She marvelled at this strange conundrum. She hadn't bothered, one way or another, to really concern herself whether Purdy was wearing her collar or not, but my grandfather loved feeding the birds in the yard, and certainly didn't want Purdy harming any of his feathery friends, so he was punctilious about putting the collar on Purdy every morning. Another bizarre thing happened, and that was that my grandmother could not find her wedding band anywhere, and she was very upset about this, because it had mysteriously disappeared. But then, against all the odds, she found the wedding band fitted on Purdy's collar, next to the bell, which was extraordinary. She began to think that maybe her husband Falcon was communicating to her from beyond the grave, because who had put the ring on Purdy's collar? This was an enigmatic mystery my grandmother could not explain. My mother, who was naturally a deeply cynical person, especially about such outlandish happenings, suggested to my grandmother that she had put the ring on Purdy's collar herself, without even realizing she had done it, in a moment of absent-mindedness. "But why would I do a thing like that?" my grandmother had protested, to which my mother replied, "Well, we all do stupid things, don't we, when a loved one passes away?" My grandmother had shrugged her shoulders and said, "Let's be clear, sweetheart. Why would I ever put my wedding band on the cat's collar? I turned this whole house upside down looking for it, and then I found it in the most obscure place. Apart from anything else, I haven't been the one putting Purdy's collar on her. It's mysteriously appeared on her neck over the last few mornings. How can you explain that? I'm quite sure it's Falcon, telling me he's still very much around." "Look, Mum," my mother had said, "I know how much you love Dad, and how sad you are about his passing. But you've got to live in the real world. You can't be in denial like this. A dead person cannot put a collar on Purdy, nor can they put a wedding band on Purdy's collar. If you didn't put it there, who did? It certainly wasn't Dad. He is dead." "How do you know it wasn't your father?" my grandmother had protested. "What do you even know about the dead?" "I know, Mum. I know enough. I know when you're dead, you're gone. You can't intercede in your loved one's life any more. And as for putting on collars, give me a break. You probably did that yourself. I'm not saying you did it purposely, with a conscience, or an awareness even, but you did so nevertheless. Maybe you so wanted to believe Dad was communicating with you. So you did this to feel comforted. It's perfectly understandable, Mum." At that, my grandmother never spoke about the subject to my mother again. I mean, what was the point? My mother didn't believe in anything outer-worldly, and her mind was as closed as the door on a hamster's cage. When I learnt that me and my sister were going to spend a few days in the countryside with my grandmother, staying at an old inn, known as the Whispering Willows Inn, that had been restored to its former glory, me and my sister Eugenie were, dare I say, reasonably excited, for we thoroughly liked the idea of jumping up and down on a trampoline on the grounds and going horse riding in the countryside. Well, it didn't get better than that, did it? And besides, it would be great fun to spend some time with our grandmother, whom we both adored. My grandmother was a wise woman, with a fabulous sense of humour, and not many people made us laugh as much as she did. And what made her even better was that my grandmother was such a childlike person in her heart. She would play with us in the way that other adults never would, and she really knew how to relate to children. So there we were, stuck in a rental car on our trip, trying to find the mysterious whereabouts of the Whispering Willows Inn. Where was it, was the number 101 question. My grandmother had obstinately refused to use a GPS. She was used to doing things the old-fashioned way. So I was seated next to her on the passenger side seat, with a map spread out on my lap, wondering why my grandmother refused to embrace technology of any kind, and why she was so dubiously suspicious of all the latest modern innovations. She barely ever used the cell phone my mother had purchased for her. When she did so with a wary scepticism, which meant my mother was always tirelessly complaining that my grandmother failed to answer her calls. But my grandmother claimed that she didn't like a cell phone to dictate her life, so getting hold of her at times was close to impossible, but my grandmother liked it that way. "Granny," I said to her as tactfully as I could, trying to hide my burgeoning frustration as best as I could, "if you use a GPS, we'll find this place we're looking for so much quicker." "Nonsense, Scott," my grandmother said. She waved a veiny hand in my direction, almost as if swatting away an annoying fly. "I've been using maps all my life to get around the place," she said firmly, "and they've served me very well, thank you very much. I'm not about to change the way I do things. Nothing wrong with the old ways at all." "But, Granny, maybe if you—" My grandmother turned around to look at me square in the face, which made me recoil from saying anything further. "Look, Scott, I know you mean well, and your heart is in the right place. But let's just say I'm an old dog that doesn't appreciate new tricks. I don't expect you to understand that, because you're not from my generation. But I've been driving for many long years, you know, and I've found my way around the place with a map without any problems at all. And I don't want to change the habits of a lifetime. Not now, anyway. It's too late for all that." "But, Granny, if you were using a GPS, you'd have already found the old inn." I could see the sweat had gathered on my grandmother's brow. She looked increasingly flustered, although she was trying to mask it well, for she didn't want us to know that she was actually out of her depth. Without wishing to be unkind, my grandmother was a dreadful driver, and she was terrible at using a map, even though she vehemently believed otherwise. In truth, I wasn't surprised that we found ourselves on an ambiguous squiggle of sequestered roads. She was exactly like my mother in that regard, as when my mother lost her bearings, she'd all but go into a frenzied panic, and usually when me and my sister went on road trips with my mother, her GPS would seem to always go haywire, for no reason at all. My mother would practically hyperventilate. She'd become so anxious and stressed. I was always the one that had to get my mother, and now my grandmother, out of some tight scrapes. But I had to do it so subtly that they didn't even know I was doing it at all. And so I was wondering to myself how I could help my grandmother find this old inn, without her believing I'd helped her at all in this regard. On this occasion my 12-year-old sister Eugenie leapt to my grandmother's defence and told me to butt out and let our grandmother find this place on the map herself. "Granny doesn't use GPSs, Scott," she told me. "You need to respect that. Not everything has to be done the modern way, you know. It's good to learn how to use a map, because what happens if one day technology collapses? It's good to learn to do things both ways, so you have security, don't you think? So you don't get yourself in a bind when technology is no longer accessible to you." "Your sister makes a very good point, Scott. These days people rely on technology all the time to do everything for them. But what if it were to fail? It certainly wouldn't harm these people to do things the old-fashioned way from time to time," said my grandmother, "so that you can function normally, even if the power grid were to collapse." "I suppose so," I mumbled under my breath, knowing there was no arguing with two feisty females that were giving me a hard time. It was best just to grit my teeth together and say nothing at all, while hoping to God we found this place. On this road trip, I hasten to say, I did have my suspicions as to my grandmother's clandestine motives for coming here in the first place. I knew my grandmother loved old Victorian houses, but I also knew she wanted to go to a place where she might be witness to some paranormal activity. Of course, I'd read the article in the magazine that my grandmother had shown me. I admit I was intrigued by the story of the workman called Sam Forrester, who claimed to have seen the apparition of a woman from the 1800s wearing a Victorian dress. Given my grandmother's own friend, Mrs. Kitman, had stayed at the old inn with her grandchildren, and they had not experienced anything strange during their stay there, I was certain that after the old inn's alterations had been completed, the house had probably settled, and the paranormal activity gone away. I was certain my grandmother would not see a ghost on our trip, and I wasn't afraid to express my thoughts on this matter. In those days I was not desperately diplomatic, and was very direct and upfront with my grandmother. for nothing I ever said was filtered, which was something that annoyed my mother, who believed that sometimes my forthright candidness might come across as being extremely rude. I had always worn my heart on my sleeve, like my grandfather Falcon had done when he was alive, and I think my grandmother Gretchen respected that about me, and often claimed I was just like her late husband. "You want to see a ghost of the Victorian woman that worker saw when they renovated the property? Is that why we're going to stay at the old inn?" I asked my grandmother directly. At this my sister Eugenie stared at my grandmother incredulously, her mouth dropping wide open, so wide in fact she could have almost swallowed a fly. My sister Eugenie knew nothing about the article that my grandmother had shared with me. "Oh no!" she cried out in horror. "Please don't tell me this place we're going to is haunted, Granny. I don't want to stay in a haunted house. I don't want to see a ghost," she had wailed. "I'm scared of ghosts, Granny Gretchen." "Oh, don't you worry, sweetheart," said my grandmother sympathetically, looking at Eugenie through devoted eyes. "Even if you were to see a ghostly apparition, which is most unlikely, it could never harm you, you know. It would be like looking at a photograph that vanishes before your very eyes. If ghosts are real, they certainly don't impose a threat to the living. I can assure you of that. They can do nothing to harm us." "But how do you know that, Granny?" "I've heard horrible ghost stories before, of people being pulled out of their beds by nasty apparitions. I've heard of people being scratched and punched and pinched." "Look, sweetheart, nothing like that is going to happen to you," my grandmother assured my sister. "My friend Mrs. Kitman stayed at the old inn with her grandchildren, didn't she? And nothing untoward happened to her. You'll be fine, I'm most sure." "I don't care," my sister wailed. "If we're staying at a haunted inn, I don't want to sleep on my own. I don't want to be in my own bedroom. I don't want to see a ghost." "Well, that's settled then, dear. We'll share a bedroom together, so that you don't have to sleep on your own. But I'm quite sure you've got nothing to worry about at all." "Why do you want to see a ghost?" Eugenie brazenly asked my grandmother. "Well, I read an article in that magazine, didn't I, all about the old inn. And even before your grandfather died, I was very fascinated and intrigued about the paranormal activity that was stirred up there. After your grandfather's passing, I thought about the article an awful lot, you know, because with your grandfather gone from this life, I miss him so dreadfully much. I thought to myself, if I went to stay somewhere that was reputed to have been haunted at some stage, where the apparition of a Victorian woman had been seen, well, if I were to see her myself, that would be confirmation to me that this life is not all there is, and that when we die, it's not completely over for us." "But why does a ghost prove the afterlife even exists?" my sister asked. "Explain that to me, Granny." "It's hard to explain, Eugenie dear. But for me personally, it would be confirmation that, we go on after this life. I believe energy goes on, you see, because energy can never die. Our physical bodies are one energy, our spiritual bodies another. I think in this life our bodies are rather like a cocoon, although we don't know it. Some people call it a meat suit, of course, that our spirit lives inside. And then when we leave that cocoon, we become like a butterfly. And we have what is known as a light body. That's what I believe. And it's identical to our physical body that we had in life, only a great deal younger and without any imperfections. Another reason I want to go to this beautiful Victorian property is to spend some quality time in a magnificent place with my grandchildren that has oodles of charm and character. An old manor house converted into an inn that is alive with history. It's just my cup of tea, Eugenie, and I'm certain it will be yours too. Mrs. Kitman took her 2 grandchildren there, and they loved every moment of their stay, to such an extent that they want to go back. And I'm quite sure you will feel much the same." "But, Granny, I don't want to upset you by saying this, But what if you don't see anything paranormal at the Whispering Willows Inn? I asked her. I know Mrs. Kitman witnessed nothing strange with her grandchildren, so why should you? And just because you don't see a ghost, it doesn't mean they're not real, or that life after death doesn't exist either. Look, love, you make some very valid points. And just so you know, I don't mind if I don't see anything paranormal. I've certainly prepared myself for that. In fact, I'm quite sure I will not see anything. Let's just say in my long life, I have had many disappointments. So if I don't see anything paradoxical, it doesn't matter to me a jot. Life is a rich tapestry of moments, like the musical notes in a pretty song. I intend to enjoy every thread that goes into weaving our story. All I care about, Scott dear, is that with your parents away on that lovely cruise liner in the Mediterranean, that I make the most of this golden opportunity to spend quality time with my two favourite grandchildren. Your mother, of course, thinks that her trip on the Mediterranean, on this lavish cruise liner, is going to out-trump any fun that we all have together. But let me tell you this, Scott, that your mother is wrong, said my grandmother, looking at us both with a determined smile that lit up her piercing blue eyes. Yes, she is wrong, said my sister Eugenie triumphantly. We're going to have a much better time staying at the inn than my mother is on that cruise liner, aren't we, Granny? But of course we are. We're going to have a much better time than they are, said my grandmother. We're going to have so much fun, and I'm going to make sure of it. Little did we know that the time we spent at the Whistling Willows Inn would be an indelible, outlandish experience that we would never ever forget. So much so that looking back, I would often say, did that actually happen? But I assure you that it did. Indeed, our stay at the inn was to be so absolutely extraordinary that I would begin to realize that the fabric of our reality is even more complicated and complex than I ever imagined it could be. We had begun our wild adventure from our home in Washington, where we had taken a flight via Air North to Dawson City and hired a car from Klondike Car Rental, and now we were on this very lonely country road that could be anywhere when you're out in the sticks, that is. The previous evening we had stayed at the Midnight Sun in Dawson City and had asked people if they'd ever heard of the Whispering Willows Inn, and they looked at us with blank faces, shrugging their shoulders and saying nonchalantly, "We've never heard of it, but then again there are lots of bed and breakfasts in these parts." My grandmother didn't tell them that the Whispering Willows Inn was not a bed and breakfast, but more like an upmarket inn or guest house, as what was the point of that? I will admit I was extremely frustrated that my grandmother was refusing to use a GPS, but I knew one thing about her. I didn't want to rub her up the wrong way. She had her old-fashioned ways of doing things, and I needed to respect that. But I was getting as frustrated as she was, as we were taking a hell of a long time in finding the inn, and I was getting stiff and uncomfortable, seated in the same position for so long, and was absolutely dying to stretch my legs. All of a sudden I noticed a road going through the trees that seemed lit up by the light of the late afternoon sun, with a shimmering, golden-like glaze. The road seemed enveloped in a swirling rainbow of moving light, the likes of such I'd never seen before. It really was an anomaly. My grandmother even said, "How extraordinary! Look how that road is lit up! Look at all that rainbow light!" I remember being startled to see this road. I felt aggrieved with myself for failing to observe it before. How could I have missed it? I was rarely an observant person, so missing something like that was very unlikely for me. Even my sister Eugenie insisted the road had not been there before, and she seemed very convinced of this fact, which was comforting for me to hear, because I was chastising myself for missing it. "Don't be ridiculous, love," my grandmother said to my sister. "We overlooked the road, that's all. It'll probably be easy to miss, you know." I knew Eugenie was right. The road had not been there before. All I could think was that this was so incredibly strange. But then I persuaded myself that my grandmother had to be right, There was no other explanation, as there is no way a road appears from nowhere just like that. We really had to have overlooked it, but how had we done this? It seemed impossible to grasp. The road was prettily covered in a shower of autumn leaves that looked like golden confetti, which was extremely unusual, as autumn was a couple of months away. But then again, some trees are known to drop their leaves earlier than others. But on this road, every tree that fringed both sides of it boasted a resplendent plumage in golds, ambers, and reds. And even my grandmother admitted that she did find this profoundly odd. "Well, all I can say is there are pockets of coldness all over the country," she told us. "So my guess that this is an area where it gets colder than other parts, which is why the trees have been programmed to turn golden before their due time. But I'm not complaining about that. It's prepossessingly beautiful, and autumn is my quintessential, most favourite time of the year." As we drove down the road, with the shimmering sun casting its golden prisms over the leafy foliage, I found myself suddenly becoming rather chilly, as there was quite a dramatic drop in the temperature. It meant that I broke out in goosebumps all over my body, and I began to physically feel the cold, when moments before I had been rather warm. Suffice to say, I was very glad that my grandmother had encouraged both me and Eugenie to pack warm clothes for this trip, because you could never be sure how the weather might turn. My grandmother emphatically believed in preparing yourself for all seasons, no matter where you went in the world, for she had learnt about this from bitter experience. She had gone to Turkey once on holiday with my grandfather when he was alive. They had both arrived in the city of Istanbul, with suitcases packed to the brim with summer clothes, and had been forced as a consequence to buy warm clothing on their trip, for they had been ill prepared for the cold spell that had hit the country so prematurely, that had been accompanied by lots and lots of rain. My grandmother therefore believed it was always best to be prepared for every eventuality. I'm glad to say it was on this prepossessing beautiful road that I could see the distant silhouettes of the mountains caught under a shimmering mist. That was when we saw the sign for the Whispering Willows Inn, and I was the first one to shout out, "Granny, look over there! We found it! We found it! That's the sign for the Whispering Willows Inn!" My voice sounded unduly triumphant. I really was ecstatic, as we had arrived at our due destination, which would mean that I would be able to get out of this uncomfortable car and finally stretch my legs. My grandmother sighed with heartfelt relief. She made the sign of the cross in the air and smiled at us both warmly. She said, "Sometimes, children, I find God answers prayer far more efficiently than a GPS ever could." She stopped the car for a brief moment, and that was when I saw him. "Look over there, Granny! He's looking straight at us. Can you see him?" "Look where?" asked my grandmother. "Who's looking at us, Scott?" "It's a Bigfoot, Granny. He spoke to me. He asked me what we're doing here. I'm not joking, Granny. I'm being serious, deadly serious." "For goodness sake, Scott, listen to yourself. You do talk nonsense," said my grandmother, scolding me. "I know we've had a tiring, very exhausting, long-winded journey, Scott, and I blame myself for it because I should have found this place sooner. But I don't appreciate your making up practical jokes like this. I don't find it amusing, Scott, not in the least. Do I look like I'm laughing?" "But he was over there," I insisted. "It was a Bigfoot. I saw him. I know it was a Bigfoot. I'm not making it up, Granny. He spoke to me in my head. It was a telepathic exchange. It wasn't my imagination, Granny, I promise you." "Then where is it now, Scott?" asked my sister Eugenie, pulling a face. "You're pathetic, Scott, making up silly stories like this. There's nothing there, and you know it." "Your brother is teasing you, love," said my grandmother. "Scott is winding us both up. He knows there's no such thing as a Bigfoot. Don't you, Scott?" said my grandmother, looking directly at me, with a stern expression written over her face. I knew she wasn't amused that I'd claimed to have seen a Bigfoot, but I knew that even if I tried to persuade her of what I'd seen, she'd never ever believe me. At the time my nose had been pinned to the window, and I had been looking at a tree, thinking what was that thing standing next to it. As my vision came into better focus, I saw the distinctive pyramid-shaped head, the burly body, the ponderous shoulders, and then as I focused more intently on what I was observing, I realized to my astonishment that I was staring at a Bigfoot. I was so incredibly astounded that I thought I was seeing things for a moment, but that was when the Bigfoot looked at me, and that's when I heard the words in my head. "What are you doing here?" The Bigfoot had scratched his head, looking extremely bewildered, and that was the impression he'd left me with. 1 minute he was there, and then he was gone, but I knew I'd seen him. The surreal experience seemed to have lasted mere seconds, and after my grandmother's dismissive, almost condescending remarks, I began to doubt what I'd seen. If you saw a fairy flying past you in the yard, and it happened so very quickly, you begin to believe you have been mistaken about what you thought you'd seen. I could hear my sister mumbling under her breath that I was such a big liar, and so I knew that I would not discuss the matter any further. But the Bigfoot's words, "What are you doing here?" remained in my head and weighed heavily on my mind. What had he meant by those words? "Ah, here we are," said my grandmother, turning towards the grandiose wrought-iron gates that were closed. That was when a young man dressed in long dark pants with a waistcoat and a necktie, who was standing outside the gate, beckoned to us, as if he was expecting us. He looked like he'd stepped out of the pages of a history book, so seeing him dressed in such formal attire took me quite aback. When he saw us driving up to the gate in the rental car, his expression was somewhat bemused, as if he believed the car we were driving was somewhat strange. My grandmother rolled down the driver's side window and gestured for the young man, indicating she wanted a word with him. He came over to us with a broad smile on his face. He looked to be in his early 20s, and one of his front teeth was missing. My grandmother said, "We have a booking for a few days at the Whispering Willows Inn. I made a booking with the caretaker. It's me and my grandchildren." "Ah, that's right. You're the Barlow family, are you not? Miss Lewis says she's expecting you. You and your 2 grandchildren, that is." "Yes, that's right. These are my 2 grandchildren, Scott and Eugenie. But the name is Bradley. It's not Barlow." "Oh," said the young man, looking apologetic. "Please accept my sincerest apologies, and forgive me for getting it so badly wrong. I must have mixed up the name. But don't worry, Miss Lewis is expecting you. But we thought you were arriving here in a horse and carriage. This vehicle of yours is extremely unusual, madam. I've never seen anything like it before." And with that he opened the wrought-iron gates, and we drove down the driveway, leaving the young man standing behind the gates, looking at us with a somewhat confounded, rather incredulous expression upon his face. "What was that about, Granny?" I asked my grandmother. "Why did he call us Barlow? And what did he mean by saying he was expecting us to arrive in a horse and carriage? And what's so special about your rental car?" "I don't know the answers to that, dear," said my grandmother. "The young man did say some strange things, did he not? But I suspect it's easy to get confused over names. I expect so many people must stay here at the inn." "Maybe he was cracking a joke," said Eugenie. "About the horse and carriage, I mean. Because that's how people would have come to this house in the olden days, during the gold rush, wouldn't they?" "Oh, goodness gracious me, Eugenie, you're exactly right. At first your brother Scott teases us about seeing a Bigfoot, and then the young man at the gate teases us by saying he expected us to arrive in a horse and carriage, and I failed to see the humour of his joke. I guess I got so flustered in trying to find the place in the first place. So my humour has simply gone to seed. Never mind, we're here, so now all is well." "Granny, why's the man dressed so funny?" asked my sister Eugenie suddenly. He's all smart and he's wearing a waistcoat and a tie. Don't you think it's a little over the top to dress so smart for the countryside?" "Well, we're staying at an old Victorian house, aren't we? Maybe the staff like to dress up in Victorian clothes. It's befitting for the theme of the house, I suspect. It's not totally unheard of for people to do that, you know." "That's so super cool," said Eugenie in delight, pressing her nose against the window. She was wearing an expression on her face of wondrous awe as my grandmother rolled down the driveway, and that was when we saw the Whispering Willows Inn for the very first time. I think all three of us gasped at once, for I have never beheld a more beautiful historic home in all of my life. It looked the kind of place where you would expect royalty to stay. It was typically a Victorian manor house, done in ornate, grandiose architecture, with those typical steeped roofs, decorative gables, large bay windows, turrets, towers, and wraparound porches. I noticed there were a couple of arched, attractive stained glass windows that immediately grabbed my attention because they were so magnificent and beautifully presented. The sizable 3-story house was impressive to behold, with an ornate facade that was incredibly elegant and stylish. The layout of the front yard was both formal but symmetrical at the same time, with stunning rockeries on display and beds of the most colourful flowers that I have ever beheld, that looked as if they were superbly maintained. If that wasn't enough, there was a walled kitchen garden where vegetables and herbs were grown. The 3-story mansion overlooked exquisite mountainous valleys, wood groves of tall lofty trees, and vibrant meadows of alpine flowers, and it rather reminded me of the Alaskan countryside in summer. "It's so beautiful, Granny Gretchen!" my sister Eugenie cried out in delight. Her enthusiasm was infectious, so much so that my grandmother smiled. She liked to see her grandchild looking so thrilled. My grandmother chuckled. "You're right, Eugenie. It is absolutely beautiful here. I will admit, in the magazine article I read about the Whistling Willows Inn, I thought it looked stunning, but in real life it exceeds my wildest expectations." It was when we arrived, another young gentleman, dressed much the same as the young man by the gate, gestured for us to park the car on the cobbled driveway, a little further away from the house. Much like the young man at the gate, he stared at our car with a rather befuddled expression on his face. Once my grandmother had parked the rental car and climbed out of the front seat, the young man helped her out of the car and gave her a polite bow. "Welcome to Whispering Willows Inn. We're delighted to have your custom, ma'am. You must be Mrs. Barlow, and these your 2 grandchildren. Miss Lewis is expecting you." "That's right," said my grandmother, "but I'm afraid you've got the name wrong. The name is Bradley, Gretchen Bradley, not Barlow. But I have made a booking for the next few days for me and my 2 grandchildren." So there we are, that's the end of part 2. Part 3 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.